Good evening. I'm Alvin Hall from the class of 1974, and I'm delighted to join you for tonight's conversation with Dr. Jessica Meir, who's in Houston, Texas. Before I introduce Dr. Meir, I want to invite you to submit questions using the Q&A tool at the bottom row of your Zoom window. We'll incorporate your questions as we move through the conversation. Given the volume of questions, we may combine questions that are similar because we are unable to be able to answer all of the questions that come through. Dr. Meir's big dream began at an early age in her hometown in Caribou, Maine. In first grade, drawing a picture of what she wanted to be when she grew up, 5-year-old Jessica drew an astronaut standing on the moon. That dream never waned. In her high school yearbook, under future plans, it reads, "To go for a spacewalk." After studying biology at Brown, she went on to earn a master's degree in space studies from the International Space University and a doctorate in marine biology from the Scripps Institution of Oceanography at the University of California, San Diego. Dr. Meir researched extreme conditions, going low with deep diving animals like emperor penguins and elephant seals, and then went in the other direction with the high altitude flying bar-headed goose, the species that flies over the Himalayas twice a year. In 2013, Dr. Meir was selected as one of 8 members of the 21st NASA astronaut class, and in September 2019, she launched as part of Expeditions 61 and 62 to the International Space Center station aboard Soyuz MS-15. A month later, she and Christine Cook became the first women to participate in an all-female spacewalk. NASA announced last year that Meir is among the candidates for the Artemis team, which will be the first human mission to orbit and land on the moon in nearly 50 years. If chosen, Meir would be the first woman on the moon. It is my pleasure to introduce NASA astronaut, marine biologist, and physiologist, Dr. Jessica Meir. Welcome, Dr. Meir. How are you?
Thank you so much, Alvin, for that incredible introduction. I'm doing very well. It is so nice to be here this evening, talking to hopefully several people back in my home state of Maine, affiliated with Bowdoin and you, of course. So it's my pleasure to be here answering your questions this evening.
Yes, I was very excited about this because Maine is so important to me. When I was a young person coming to college, I chose to come to Maine because it was farthest away from my parents in Florida. And so I've always had a big space in my heart for Maine. Reading about your life over the past week or so, one question kept coming up. Having been born in Caribou, Maine, how did you figure out this path to where you are today?
Well, that's a good question. It was something that I did have to figure out, but I think for me, things really just kind of fell in place because I started from the time when I was very young, following what I loved and being very much encouraged to follow my heart and follow my goals and my dreams by my family and by my mentors along the way. So as you mentioned, I started saying I wanted to be an astronaut when I was 5 years old. And it's an interesting process. You know, people ask me all the time, was there one event or something? Did you meet someone? What was it? For me, it was a small town. Caribou, Maine is a pretty small town, as all those people in Maine know. It's pretty far, pretty remote, away from any major cities. And I'm actually a first generation American. Both of my parents are from other countries. They only came here in the early 70s. So we didn't know anybody that worked at NASA. I hadn't really been exposed to anyone that worked there or any particular NASA related activity when I was a kid. But something must have identified with me. And I like to trace it back to just an interest in exploration, really. I think that's what has driven me throughout my life. Growing up as a kid, surrounded by Maine's forests and lakes, with a Swedish mother who was very encouraged about maintaining this connection with nature. I think that drove my scientific curiosity and just my inquisitiveness about the world around me, that curiosity, just kind of wondering why are things the way they are. And biology was my favorite subject from the beginning. So that was something that I really wanted to continue to ask questions about. And then something must have put this spark there about wanting to be an astronaut. And I think, maybe it was because growing up as a kid in the 80s and 90s, the space shuttle program was very active. And I know that you remember, Alvin, how it was back then. We didn't have the internet to seek out sources of information and knowledge. We got our news from the newspaper or from the radio or from the evening news. And a lot of the space shuttle missions were always popularized on the evening news. They were the launches were always broadcast. So I think I caught something about that caught my eye, and maybe that combined with my scientific curiosity and this drive for exploration really just combined to set this goal. But I just didn't stop saying it from the time I was 5 years old. Sometimes I joke that maybe I was just not creative enough to switch that. A lot of children say they want to be astronauts when they grow up, but it was always something that people associated with me. They called me Space Girl. My classmates growing up in middle school and high school knew that was my goal, and my parents, my family, my friends, all the way through. So I decided to pursue my interest in biology. That was my favorite subject. That's what I majored in my undergraduate years. But at the same time, I was trying to be involved with any NASA related activity I could find, starting from the time when I went to space camp at Purdue University before I was in high school. So really just trying to pave my own path. And that's one of the things, the pieces of advice that I like to give people, because I don't think it's a good idea to say, okay, Jessica, what's the recipe to be an astronaut? Which boxes do I need to check to do this? And I think that that's just the wrong way to go about any goal. It's not about checking boxes. It's about following your passion, following your heart, finding that one thing that really drives you and inspires you, because that's the thing that you'll really excel at. And that's what will make you happen in the end. And then along with that takes a lot of perseverance, hard work, being willing to take a risk, to know that you'll fail along the way. And so I think that's kind of sums up how I defined this path in getting here. And really, I didn't think it would ever happen. We all know that it's such a small chance of anyone becoming an astronaut just because of the numbers. But, there's a lot of luck involved as well. So I think that's another big element that all of us totally appreciate that are here on this side now.
I'm so glad to hear you say that, because most people don't think about luck as a component of this, but you have to have both that passion and that luck. And occasionally you must be willing to take a risk at something you may fail at.
Absolutely.
So I know you went to Purdue University to study for summer camp, and then you went down to NASA. What were those experiences like when you were so young? And did they sort of just inspire you and make you want to do more?
They absolutely did. And, that was one thing. I always say, I didn't go to the real space camp, the one that we've seen in the movies in Huntsville, Alabama, that's put on by NASA. The space camp I went to was at Purdue University, but that was particularly meaningful to me because at the time, my older sister was there doing her graduate work at Purdue. And that's been one thing that for me has always been such a strong connection. I'm the youngest of 5 kids, so I had 3 sisters and an older brother to emulate and to look up to from the time I was a kid, and these supportive parents. So that was another, added element to being there in Purdue for that summer. And then I think the one you were referencing was a summer program that I did when I was a university student. I went to Florida, to your home state, and was at the Kennedy Space Center doing a space life sciences training program. And that was an extraordinary opportunity where we were fully funded to go to Florida, to live and work there for 6 weeks, to work in the NASA labs, to get training and instruction of all of the different areas at NASA, and to even conduct some scientific research experiments. So it was really an extraordinary opportunity. And I was just so excited to be experiencing, real NASA things, talking to people that work there, meeting astronauts. It seemed almost too good to be true.
Yes. Liz Armstrong sent in a question. She asked, did you have a teacher or mentor who encouraged you to, quote, aim high? Tell us about the people who inspired and encouraged you.
I certainly did. And it's not just one. I mean, there are so many. It goes all the way back to when I was a kid growing up in Caribou. I remember distinctly that teacher that was there in the first grade that asked us to draw that picture of what we wanted to be when we grew up. Mrs. Belanger, she was the one that asked us to do that. And all of my science teachers growing up, I had Mrs. Thibodeau for biology. I had Mr. Thibodeau for a science class in which we would watch nature documentaries in class. And these were the things that I think just really helped inspire me and think, yeah, this is so cool. I want to study this. I want to know more about it. And then from the time I went on as an undergraduate and as a graduate student, my mentors, I was just so fortunate to be surrounded by these kind of people that were not only the top of their field. So, now when I talk about my graduate work at the Scripps Institution of Oceanography or my postdoctoral work at the University of British Columbia, here I was finally working, and I had obtained my PhD and I was doing research in the field with animals, and it was just such an apex of all these things that I had done. And I was working with these people that were not only at the top of their field, but they were also incredible people. And I think that really, to me, is what made the difference in this trajectory and in making this all come true, was that they didn't only care about the science, they also cared about me as a person. And I was so fortunate to have those people in my life, because I think that's what motivated me and just made it so much more meaningful and so much more enjoyable throughout the entire process, that I continued on. I had that kind of support network that I needed when times were difficult and frustrating. And of course they were, for all of us, we've hit those roadblocks in the way. And because I had those mentors that then could pull me through those times, not just academically and
Yes.
scientifically, but as a person, I think that made all the difference for me.
It's so funny you're saying that, and it's really touching my heart, because that was the case for me at Bowdoin, having come from a farm in Florida. And I came to the college, and the faculty, people in town cared about me as a person, and which is why I've stayed involved with the college over all these years. And they really do help you to realize the best in yourself, to let you expand and let your dreams grow bigger and bigger. And that's really wonderful to hear. One lady writes, I think it's Kim Burgess, she writes, could you speak to any barriers to women advancing in your field? Sexism may have experienced, the sexism you may have experienced as you progressed, women who inspired you along that journey.
Yeah, that's another area that has come to mean a lot to me in processing kind of the evolution of where I came from and grew up, and particularly with the event that you mentioned earlier in the introduction of this, conducting this first all-female spacewalk. And the first part of the question I would answer as saying, I, looking back on it, I was incredibly lucky. I actually did not face any of those barriers in my childhood or growing up where I ever thought that there was something that I couldn't do because of the fact that I was a woman, because of the fact that of where I came from, what I looked like. I was surrounded by these great mentors, this supportive network starting from the time I was a kid with my family, that didn't even register to me. Now, I know that that's not true. It's still not true to this day for everyone. I wish it were the case. But for me personally, I didn't really have any of those big setbacks or big challenges along the way because of that. Even
Yes.
though I was involved in some disciplines and some activities like getting my pilot's license that were more male dominated along the way, nobody ever looked at me and doubted that I could do it. So I think that was a big step in it. So it just didn't even occur to me that I couldn't do it, which is a really positive step in what we need to be instilling in children right now that are growing up from all, no matter what background they are, no matter what they look like, all minorities represented, to show them that really anything is possible. So that is in their mind. They don't have that seed of doubt that is planted. And when
Yes.
I came to NASA in 2013, it was the first time that a class of astronauts that was selected that was 50% male and 50% female. So that got a lot of focus. There's a lot of attention. People were really excited about that. And so that was kind of the next step in that evolutionary process where we kind of thought, well, wait a minute, we're here because we worked really hard. We got lucky just like these people did, but we're all here for the same reasons. So why are we focusing so much on this? Shouldn't we just be celebrated for our achievements? And, I think sometimes women and minorities, other people have a little bit of a struggle with that, where they don't necessarily want it pointed out because perhaps then it takes away from what they have just simply accomplished. Then I would say, when in the culmination of this all female spacewalk that Christina Cook and I conducted last year for the first time, that was another step in this evolutionary process where I had recently arrived on the space station. I had only been up there for about 2 weeks. At that point, you're kind of still learning how to float, how to just do all of your normal daily functions. And then I had to get ready for my first spacewalk ever in my career. And a spacewalk is the most challenging thing that we do as astronauts, and it's the riskiest thing that we do. And it's that challenging thing both mentally and physically. So I had to focus 100% on what I had to do that day, with the mission that we had set forth to go out there and work on the power channel of the space station. And I had to make sure that I knew how to do that safely, to take care of myself in my spacesuit, which is, your own little self-contained spacecraft, essentially, and to make sure that Christina, that she was safe too, and I could rescue her if I needed to, or whatever whatever situation presented itself. So I was not focusing on this more philosophical component during that time phase because I just had to focus 100% on getting the job done. Afterward, I had a lot more time to process it, and that kind of brings me to that final step of that evolution of what this really meant to me. And first of all, I was simply shocked by how many people had tuned in that day, how many people were watching and paying attention, and the feedback that we were getting, how inspiring it was for people, how excited they were about it. And that was very surprising for me. It blew my mind, actually. I mean, we do spacewalks often on the International Space Station, and most of the time people aren't watching. I mean, most of the time it's actually pretty boring to watch if you don't know what's happening. But whatever reason it was, whatever culmination of things that had happened, people were paying attention that day. And so I realized that, then it was my responsibility to represent that, to cherish that moment, and to understand what it meant to people. And for me, for both Christina and myself, we didn't feel like it was a personal achievement. We were back to just kind of resting on our training, doing our job that day. But what it meant was that we should be celebrating. And it was really a tribute. It was paying homage to these generations of women and other minorities that truly did push all of those boundaries so that it just felt normal for us. We were there doing our job that day only because the generations before us had worked so hard when we truly didn't have a seat at the table. And so for me, it was just, this is a moment to celebrate them. If I'm going to be the image of that, then I will take that responsibility and we can do what we can to inspire others. But really, this moment is to celebrate them. And I hope that all those people watching realize that those individuals that got us where we are today were the ones to be able to revel in that. And I certainly am not saying that we've achieved it all, we're done. We are certainly not done progressing. You know that as well as I do, particularly with the civil unrest that we've experienced in our nation in recent times. We have a lot of room to grow, but I can say that for me, it's so nice to see how far we've come and to thank all those people that have done all that work before us.
Your words remind me so much of a spiritual that I grew up with, which was always a celebration, which is up above my head. I hear music in the air. And I always imagined that as you were doing your spacewalk and you and Christina came back, there were all these people who came before you celebrating, applauding what you had done. But for you, it was doing your job. And that is the modesty of you and the modesty of Christina, which is a beautiful thing, a beautiful way of expressing it, actually. You went to college and you studied extremes. I kept thinking as I was reading this, was it because of the weather in Caribou, Maine, that you studied these extremes?
It may well be part of it. I'm not sure where that came from either, but I did grow up in a pretty extreme corner of the United States. Like I mentioned, I was a first generation American. My mom grew up in Sweden, and so that's a pretty extreme weather climate zone as well. And so I don't know what it was. I think it just made sense to me. If you're interested, for me, it was this interest in animal behavior, understanding, looking around, observing the behavior of all these different animals on our planet, how extraordinary they are. I mean, we have animals that can plunge to the depths of the ocean, that can fly and live at high altitudes, that can fly all around the planet practically in one migration. These kinds of feats that these animals can undertake are simply incredulous. I mean, it's difficult to believe how they can do it. If you look at us as humans, our physiology is certainly boring compared to what these kind of animals can accomplish. And so to me, I just thought, wow, I want to understand more. I see that they can do these things, but how can they do these things? I really wanted to understand more about their particular physiology. What is different about their bodies? How have they evolved? What adaptations do they have to be able to accomplish these things? So it kind of made sense to me to start at the extreme ends of the spectrum, the deep, not just a diving animal, but the deepest diving animal. Not just an animal living at high altitude, but one that migrates over the Himalayas. If you look at those extremes, then you're probably going to find, or at least I hypothesize that we might find some of the more extreme adaptations because of that kind of behavior requiring those sort of physiological changes. And so that kind of made sense to me. But I think part of it is also just my nature in the spirit of exploration. I like to talk about it as being kind of full circle, where I studied these animals. First I was here working at the Johnson Space Center, coordinating life science experiments on astronauts that were in space. And then I left NASA. I went back to school and I started doing all of my own experiments on animals. And now it's kind of like I'm the animal in the extreme environment, the most extreme environment of the space station, and I'm being poked and prodded in the name of science. So it's probably just me paying my dues at this point.
I love that. You're being poked and prodded. What are they looking for when they're examining your body? I'm very curious about that.
Yeah, everything. So, the real motivation behind the International Space Station, especially now that it's been fully built for several years, the construction is finished, is we are using it as a world-class laboratory. So we are doing scientific experiments ranging from how microgravity and the spaceflight environment affect our human bodies, because we want to understand, to make sure if I'm going to be up there for 7 months, then we need to make sure that I come back healthy. So what do we need to do? One of the big things that we do is exercise, for example, and we learned that through doing research. We do combustion experiments. Even flames burn differently in space. Things don't rise. You don't have this kind of resulting convection like we do have here on Earth. We look at material science experiments, radiation, what happens in these kind of environments. We look at cell cultures. So how does the microgravity environment affect the mechanisms at a cellular level, looking at bone cells, looking at muscle cells. So really any aspect of science, if you think about it, it's extraordinarily interesting, because every system, no matter what branch of science it is here on Earth, every system has been subjected to this omnipresent gravitational vector, this 1G environment from the beginning of time of the human species. So every process is, and even before humans, right? Any geologic, any kind of physical chemical system. So what happens if you suddenly remove this really big variable? I call it like the elephant in the room. If you remove that elephant in the room, you don't know what's going to happen. Sometimes the most extraordinary findings in science are those unanticipated ones. So that's why the spaceflight environment is such a unique one. We have the vacuum of space. We have the difference in radiation. We're not protected by our atmosphere, and we have weightlessness. We have huge thermal variation. So all of these different factors are so different that it makes it just opens up a whole host of responses in any type of these scientific systems. So to go back to that initial question, we are part of those experimental systems. We want to understand how the spaceflight environments affects our bodies. So we do all kinds of different experiments, looking at our cardiovascular system, looking at blood flow changes. We have this upward shift of our body fluids without gravity. Right here, we're sitting here, and right now, all of the blood is being pulled down to our feet, right? Because that's just normal, the gravitational force. You remove that, everything moves up, including your internal fluids and organs. So we're looking at the differences there. We're looking at changes that might be induced by the radiation levels or any of the other factors of the spaceflight environment. So we're actually subjects for all of those experiments while we're up in space.
One of the questions that keeps coming up, and it's several people have asked it, is how did your experience as a marine biologist help you as an astronaut?
I think it's more fundamental than that. It's really my experience as a scientist in terms of those kind of critical thinking skills. And of course, the obvious implication is all of these scientific experiments that I'm conducting as an operator while on the space station. I like to think that my training and experience as a scientist helps me be a better operator to collect those kind of data sets for all of the scientists that have worked so hard that are back down there on the ground, and I'm the one now responsible for their experiment. And then I think it does go also to this kind of exploration and this extreme environment thing that we were just talking about. For me, the type of research that I was doing was in extreme environments. I was doing research with emperor penguins in the Antarctic. I was diving down there myself underneath the sea ice in a dry suit in that kind of extreme climate zone. And so all of that kind of experience living and working in environments like the Antarctic helped prepare me with a whole host of skill sets that really is applicable to what I do now as an astronaut. Working in those kinds of environments with a small team in an isolated setting, it's exactly what we do on the space station. So it was kind of a bit of a risk mitigation for NASA to select me as an astronaut because they knew that I had experience working in those environments. They knew that psychologically, technically, mentally, I probably would do okay. I would do well in those kinds of settings. And so, we use those kind of comparison analog environments in understanding more about the types of people that we'll select as astronauts. So I think that that kind of research, technical scuba diving in the Antarctic, fixing broken snowmobiles and shoveling snow, it wasn't just academic. It was all of those other things combined that made it a mental and a physical challenge. And I think that really is exactly what's represented in this job serving as an astronaut.
It's really about the psychology, the strength within you, and how you are practical and can respond to certain types of changes and emergencies. I know that when you were selected for the astronaut program, you went through 2 years of training, correct?
Yes.
What was that like?
Yeah, so those first 2 years are what we call astronaut candidate training. So it's kind of like basic training for astronauts, where you are in this totally new environment with your classmates. And even though you are all kind of at the peak of your individual careers, all those careers are very diverse. So I was a scientist, but some of my classmates were military pilots. We had a military doctor, we had flight test engineer, we had instrumentation engineer. So we had people with all different backgrounds. But now we were all here together, starting and embarking on this one common job, and we had to learn all of these basic skills that astronauts need in all missions. So those things was really five main components. One was flight training. So those of us that didn't have careers in military aviation, had some additional flight training, and then we all learned how to fly the NASA T-38 jet that we use for training here. That was also learning how to use the spacesuit. So, the spacesuit that we use for spacewalks is an incredibly big, bulky, heavy apparatus. And we have to train a lot to learn how to move around that suit. That's definitely, as I mentioned, the really the most challenging thing that we do. We have a giant pool here at NASA at the Johnson Space Center where we train how to do that underwater. We also learn how to fly the robotic arm. The space station has the Canadarm, made by the Canadian Space Agency. And it's this large robotic arm on the outside of the space station that was used in the construction of the space station. It's used to move different modules or pieces of equipment around. And we also use it on spacewalks. So for example, in one of the spacewalks during my mission, I was inside the space station flying the robotic arm from a little kind of control station like you're playing a video game. And my friend was on the end of that arm. I was flying him around to his work site. So that's another one of the things that we learned in the beginning. We also learn all about the various systems of the International Space Station. So how does everything work up there? We're going to not only need to do the experiments, we're also going to have to fix the toilet when it breaks, change a light bulb, do maintenance and repairs on all of the different systems on board the space station. And the last main area during those first 2 years is Russian language training. So all astronauts and cosmonauts that are on the International Space Station, everybody has to speak both English and Russian. So for me, that was another really exciting component. I love learning languages, and we had to reach a certain level of Russian language proficiency before we graduated. So we had to, graduate from all those 5 different areas. We had some additional training as well, kind of leadership stuff, survival training, various things along the way. And we had to reach a certain level of proficiency in each area. And then we graduated and became astronauts. So we dropped the candidate portion of our term, and that meant we were ready to be assigned to a mission. So we had all the basic skills, and then we were waiting to be assigned for our specific mission. And then that would begin another 1.5 to 2 years of training for that specific mission.
Several questions have come up asking, what is it like when you take off in the Soyuz craft? What is it like? The feel? That question is everywhere.
Yeah, well, I can tell you it's simply incredible and something I think back to a lot. So I launched, as you mentioned, on a Soyuz rocket and a Soyuz spacecraft, and that is the Russian Space Agency's rocket. The space shuttle that I'm sure many of you remember was retired back in 2011. So we didn't have a replacement vehicle lined up. And so at that time, until just recently, we were launching only with the Russians in order to get to the space station. So that's where I launched for my mission. Now I'm sure you've seen the SpaceX Dragon is operating and sending astronauts trading off with the Soyuz to send astronauts and cosmonauts up to the space station as well. So I did much of my training in the about 1.5 to 2 years before I flew in Russia, because I was actually the pilot. So there are 3 people in a Soyuz spacecraft. There's the commander who sits in the middle. That's always a Russian because it's their spacecraft. Then there's the pilot there on the left that's helping the commander do everything, monitoring systems, sending commands. And then the third seat on the right seat can actually be even a tourist, because the spacecraft was designed to be flown by 2 people. But if we have another qualified astronaut in that seat, then they can absolutely be of assistance as well in terms of flying the spacecraft. So when we were there for launch day, and this is, as you mentioned, September of 2019, the Soyuz launches from Baikonur Cosmodrome in Kazakhstan, kind of the middle of nowhere, where you see a rocket mounted in the middle of the steppe, camels, walking by, and just an extraordinary landscape. So we got in the rocket that day, and I'll tell you, it simply felt surreal, because I had dreamed of that moment since I was 5 years old. I had been preparing that moment for that moment for years. And we get into the spacecraft, and now it looks just like the simulator, because we had these really high fidelity simulators in the Cosmonaut Training Center in Star City, which is just outside of Moscow. And I had done all these things so many times, because we do so many simulations over and over and over again in our training, where we're seeing all of the same things on the displays, we're pressing the buttons, we're sending the commands. And so I got in there that day and I was like, okay, first of all, focus, don't make a mistake. Let's just do what we've been trained to do. And so you start going through all of your checklists and preparing everything. And because we've done it so many times before, it really had just become kind of automatic. So I had to actually remind myself that we were going to space that day, because normally I do all those things and then we get out of the simulator and go home for the evening. But suddenly, every once in a while there was a groan of the engines or a slight movement of the rocket. And that, really made us remember, oh, wait a minute, there's going to be a much different result at the end of today's launch sequence. And so that moment when we actually lift it off and you feel the power of the engines, and then you start seeing things as throughout the launch sequence, as the different stages of the rocket separate and the shroud comes off and then your window is revealed. And you feel each of those things, because there's a difference, there's a push, there's a change in the gravity level that we're experiencing as the rockets, change in the different phases of flight. And then only about 8 minutes later, after we've launched, we are now in space. And so now you're experiencing this sustained weightlessness for the first time. And that moment, I will always remember. I looked out the window and you could see the curvature of the Earth. And then, we are still strapped in our seats, in our seat belts. So we're not lifting up completely ourselves, but everything around us, our arms are starting to lift up a little bit. And even little bits of dust or anything that you may have dropped in the capsule, everything starts floating up. Your pencils in front of you start floating up. And I looked over at my crewmates, and Oleg Skripochka, our Russian commander, he had been to space before. So this wasn't a new thing for him. But Hazza Ali al-Mansouri, was the very first astronaut from the United Arab Emirates. So it was also his first time in space. And our eyes met across the capsule, and we were just, both of us in awe, thinking, this is it. This is, wow, this is real now. And you feel like a kid if you're at a playground and you're hanging upside down from the monkey bars. That's what you feel like, because like I was talking about, all that blood kind of lifts up and everything kind of moves up to your head. And so you feel like you're hanging upside down. And I like to think I felt kind of like, since I studied animals, I felt like a bat hanging upside down to sleep. And that feeling just doesn't really go away. It's sustained, and then your body kind of adapts and gets used to it. So that's kind of what a launch feels like.
Wow. I thought it would be, you would say that it was like a force shaking like this, because that's what we always imagine, that there's so many G's hitting you as you're taking off that you're just sort of pressed back in the chair and unable to move. But it's
Yeah,
not
and
that sensation.
that is true. You can feel that. And that's especially when you have these different, like the separation of different stages and the lighting of those engines, you feel the differences in those G forces. But it was overall really a smooth ride. So, I didn't feel like I was being jostled around too much or anything. It was pretty impressively smooth.
Once you get to the space station, do they have a daily regimen, like on Monday you'll do this, Tuesday you'll do this, like visiting somebody's country house, where everything is pre-scheduled?
Absolutely, everything is scheduled. It is not at all up to us, because, as you can imagine, our time up there is a very precious resource. There are so many things that need to be accomplished in terms of the regular maintenance on the space station systems, all the different scientific experiments that need to be conducted. And there are so many people on the ground that are, waiting for that precious time for us to do their work. So all of the things that we do are prepared for us by the ground teams. And in the morning when we wake up, we look at our computer, we look at a schedule. We have a special little scheduling program that we use. And there's a line for each of us. Our name is on there. And then our entire day's activities are on that timeline, each individual activity. And you can click on the little box for that activity. It will give you the procedure you need to follow, any other special notes that you need to know. Of course, you can always call the ground teams in mission control if you need any further clarification. But our days are absolutely, filled up to the brim and scheduled for us by the ground.
When I think of the spacewalk itself, I have always imagined that it's like learning choreography, a very difficult dance in which you have to know how to breathe, you have to know how to move your arm, you have to be in control of every motion, but it's probably more slow motion than I imagine. Could you describe the spacewalk for us and how that feels?
Yeah, absolutely. I really like that comparison. That does ring true. Part of it, the first thing I'll say is, we have a saying in our spacewalk training, slow is fast, because you need that. You don't want to rush through everything. You're in this big, bulky spacesuit. You weigh over 400 pounds. It's incredibly awkward because it's pressurized. Each motion is kind of like crushing an exercise ball. So it's really difficult to operate things because you have this big glove on. So you don't have the kind of dexterity that you're used to. So we have all these specialized tools and specialized interfaces. And the reason why it's so very well choreographed, like you say, is because of our training on the ground. And again, because of those ground support teams. So we have a whole division here at NASA that is responsible for developing everything that we need for a spacewalk, the tools that we need, the spacesuits, maintaining those, coming up with the procedures that we will follow in order to do whatever repair it was. So for me and my spacewalks, we were working on the power channel. One of the things that we were doing was replacing the batteries on the space station. So we were replacing them, upgrading them to lithium ion batteries, just like the kind of batteries you would use down here in a laptop or a phone, to give ourselves better power posture, to give ourselves more power on the space station. If you've ever seen a picture of the space station, you see those incredibly large solar arrays. And so all of that energy, all that power is coming from the sun, but we have to harness that energy and store it in a battery, because we also go through periods of darkness in every orbit. So when the sun isn't shining on the panels, we rely on those batteries to provide all the power for the space station. So we had practiced that in the pool, in the neutral buoyancy lab, in the spacesuits. We had spent hours and hours and hours learning these basic spacewalking skills. So it was so choreographed. when I came out of the airlock for that very first spacewalk, my hands just started moving. I had this muscle memory because I'd practiced it so many times. And that really, it's a good testament to how we do everything, especially these high risk activities in space flight, because we are so well trained that we can remove that psychological component. You know, sometimes it can be different people experience different things, but it can be pretty daunting to go out of the hatch for the first time and to see that Earth spinning below. And so you can help alleviate that by you just rely on this muscle memory. I'm just now doing that exact choreography that I was taught by the great choreographer on the ground. And I was just following along with that muscle memory and doing the tasks. And then, of course, you're also speaking to the ground teams during the spacewalk, and they're guiding you through. So now, unlike a ballet dancer who has to remember all those moves, or maybe an actor in a play that has to remember those lines, I'm actually being coached along. Like, hey, Jessica, don't forget to pick up that bag. And remember that when you use this wrench on that piece of hardware, you need to do this. And when you use that drill, here are your settings. So that I don't have to remember all those things. They're feeding that to me real time to make sure that it's all done correctly. So I really like how you put that. I think maybe I'll use that from now on about this incredible ballet that we're conducting in space. And you're certainly not as graceful as a ballerina in this giant suit. You feel quite awkward a lot of times, but slow is fast. So, you just treasure each individual movement to get the job done.
When you're out there, outside the International Space Station, and you take a moment to look at Earth, what does it look like? How does it affect you spiritually?
Well, it is definitely the most beautiful thing that I've ever seen. And it's an interesting note that you asked about that while in the spacesuit, because it's actually even more beautiful when you see that when you're in the spacesuit than when you're just inside the space station looking out the window. And part of that, I think, is because it's just you. You're floating there, and you would just, nothing is separating you and the vast and black void, the void of space, than this thin visor. And then down below is this brilliant blue gem, and the colors are simply extraordinary. The color palette that you can see with the human eye, I think we can't even really replicate it in the photographs that we send down, just because of how the human eye sees and interprets things versus how they're captured digitally. And you see this brilliant blue gem beneath you and all of the colors. I had no idea, for example, how many different textures and colors of sand dunes there were around the world. It is extraordinary. It is like a work of art. I took a lot of pictures from the inside of the space station with a 400 millimeter lens. And from that, I mean, some of these pictures, it looks like modern art. I mean, it's hard to believe these are naturally occurring areas on the Earth because they're so stunningly beautiful and abstract, and all of these colors and textures coming together. One of the things that really stood out to me was looking at this thin band of the atmosphere. And it's very, people talk all the time about how it's so thin, and you realize that's all that's protecting our planet, how that makes us realize how fragile our planet is, and we need to protect it because we only have one home. The other thing that I noticed, all that is absolutely true. And I've always been an environmentalist, and so that resonated even more loudly when I was in space. But looking at that atmosphere, something that I hadn't been able to pick out in the photos and videos that I saw, you could actually see the different gradients of blue. It was darker blue near the surface, where the atmosphere is thicker. And then as you increase altitude, get further away from the planet, it gets lighter and lighter and lighter and lighter blue until eventually it disappears into the blackness of space. So seeing that, I think, really does change you as a person. And, there's a name for it, the overview effect that Frank White described, and how it changes you as a person when you're that fortunate to look down on the Earth with your own eyes. And for me, it was that, that appreciation, resonating even more loudly how precious our planet is, how we all need to do our part in protecting it. And then also seeing how interconnected everything is. These interconnected, nonstop land masses and oceans. You don't see any of these man-made boundaries that we've imposed upon ourselves as humans. And you realize that it's one. There's one planet down there. It's the only one that has that we know that has air, that has water, that has these things that we need to support ourselves and to support all the other life on our planet. And we are all connected. There is simply one planet. It is all of our planet. And that kind of perspective and feeling this interconnectedness and knowing that all humans, despite how different we may seem and all the differences that we like to bring up, we really are all in this together. And that was extremely profound for me to experience. And I know other astronauts feel the same way. I just wish that I could share that perspective with everybody on Earth because it's such a powerful one. And I think that people could really benefit from to gain that added perspective and that big picture.
Are there days once you return to Earth when you're walking down the street or you're walking along the beach or you're walking through a grassy knoll and you look up and you imagine it from both points of view?
Yes, absolutely. I remarked a lot about that when I first came back, and I was used to looking down on clouds. At first, when you get to space, you're thinking, I've never seen clouds. Maybe in airplanes, sometimes, you're looking down at clouds, but not in their whole entirety. All of them are below you. And even just looking at clouds from space is simply so beautiful, again, like a work of art. And so now being on Earth, I do think about that sometimes. I'll tell you, I miss those views so much. I miss that feeling of floating and of looking down on the planet and appreciating the beauty every day. But it's hard to reconcile and hard for me to believe. You know, I sometimes will watch the space station pass over. And if you've never done that, I highly recommend it. There are a lot of different apps you can download on your phone, Spot the Station, various different International Space Station apps where you can see what the forecast is. And when you see the space station pass over at night, if you've ever seen a satellite, you see an object moving across the sky, and the space station is the brightest of any of those satellites because of all the light reflecting off of those arrays. And so you can watch it, and it's interesting. I'll think, that's where I was, last year, and that's where my friends are right now. But sometimes it's hard for my brain to really kind of make that connection, to understand that. And I felt that way even when I was on the space station looking down, because it seemed so surreal. I understood the science, I understood the physics of why I was there and how I got there. But to think, you're looking down on the planet, you're floating, there's 3 or 6 people up here right now. Everybody else, all 7.5 billion people, are down there, every place I've ever been. And I'm up here floating, circling around the planet every 90 minutes. I mean, it sounds kind of silly, but at first you feel like, am I on a movie set? Like, how is this real? How am I actually experiencing this? And that was never really lost on me, that feeling of how incredible it was, just how different it was from really everything you've ever experienced. So very, very much miss those views. And I wish sometimes I also have to remind myself to, take that step back again and appreciate that perspective, because it is very easy for any human, to concentrate on those things that are right in front of you. Some of them, may be obviously superficial, but it's really easy to get caught up in all of those small things that you're experiencing in the moment and that are right in front of you. But that's the one thing I try to remember when I start doing that again is, take a step back, like remember what we are all a part of here. And, if you can maintain that perspective, I think it can really help you get through a lot of difficult situations.
So you circle the Earth every 90 minutes. What are the periods of daylight? How long do they last? And what are the periods of night? I never thought about that until you said that.
Yeah, that's another really special thing about the orbit of the space station. So the space station is in what we call low Earth orbit. So it's about 250 miles above the planet. I think that's about the distance from Bowdoin College to probably somewhere around where you are in New York. I think technically maybe around Long Island, but that's the kind of distance that we're talking. So it's, you can drive that in a day. It's not that far. But of course, it feels a little bit different when you're going off the surface of the planet. But at that altitude, we are going around the planet every 90 minutes. So that means we see 16 sunrises and sunsets per day. So it depends, because we're also at an orbital, we are at an inclined orbit. We're not just, going around the equator the whole time. So you're going from northern hemisphere to southern hemisphere. And depending on the particular angles and where the sun is, it's not exactly equal. But you're experiencing about 45 minutes or of darkness and 45 minutes of light over and over and over again during the day. So that's another really interesting part in seeing those sunrises and sunsets. It's such an extraordinary view when you see these bands of red and orange and yellow, and suddenly, the earth emerges and you go from seeing this blackness to seeing all of the colors again. And it's simply beautiful. But it is, yeah, it's definitely an interesting component of living on the space station.
Thank you. I never thought about that until this very moment. We have several questions that are much more personal about self-care. As you know, during the pandemic, all of us were isolated, very much like you were in many cases, up there for 205 days on the International spacecraft. So what type of self-care did you do to maintain yourself during that time?
Yeah, it's a really good point. And that's something that we think a lot about as astronauts, because, we're not just on a short mission. We're on this long duration mission, typically about 6 months. My mission was almost 7 months. We've had some astronauts up to almost a year or so. So things become a lot more important in the psychological realm, just in terms of mental health and well-being, similar to what everyone has had to focus on a bit with this pandemic and the isolation and confinement that have gone along with it. For us as astronauts, I think we approach those problems from a few different viewpoints. And the first is how we're selected as astronauts. So we have a lot of medical and psychological screening before we're selected. So we try to make sure we're picking people that do okay in those kind of environments. So that's kind of step one. Like I mentioned before, I had lived and worked in the Antarctic, in another harsh, isolated, confined area. And so that gave them some confidence that I'd be okay on the space station. The other thing is we actually train these skills as astronauts. I mentioned the core competencies that we look at during those astronaut candidate years, but we're also doing things like going on NOLS, National Outdoor Leadership School, hikes. So we went on a 10-day hike with my entire class, living together, working in this, confined setting out in the woods, where we had to carry everything with us and work as a team. And so we're concentrating on understanding those aspects of our behavior, things that come out when you're pushed to your limit or you're a little bit outside of your comfort zone, things like leadership and followership and communication, and how important all of those things are, how much more important they become when you're in that kind of isolated setting and when you're living and working with a small team that you're with all the time. And that's the thing, on the International Space Station, we are together with our coworkers like the normal workday, just like everyone here on Earth. But then we never go home. We are living with them in the evening and every weekend. And so those kinds of things that might be okay in a small term environment might become annoying to you. And so you need to recognize those things in yourself and in other people to learn how to work together effectively as a team. So we are selecting astronauts that way. We're training them and reinforcing them through all of these different things we do at NASA. And then we have incredible support teams when we're up there as well. We have psychologists and psychiatrists on the ground that we tag up with every couple weeks to check in. We have a behavioral health and performance team that does things like sends us care packages, arranges family conferences with our loved ones back home every couple weeks. So we actually have a two-way video chat. So things like that to help people through all of those, that period of isolation and confinement. So there were a lot of similarities to what was going on the ground. When we launched September 2019, we didn't know what COVID-19 was. So we watched the entire global pandemic blanket the globe from our vantage point on the space station. And that was another surreal moment when we were the only 3 individuals that weren't subjected to this pandemic. And that was such a strange thing and made for a very difficult transition in coming back. But some of the things that we did, and we actually shared some of these things through videos while we were still in space to help people develop some of these strategies, because we realized the average person doesn't have the type of training that we have as astronauts. And some of those things were, making sure you stick to a schedule. Like you asked me, we have a very strict schedule up there that helps us get through, these long work days. We make sure we exercise every day, and that's so important, not just for our physical well-being, but for our mental health. We keep in contact with people on the ground. We have these effective communication strategies to help each other out. So all those things, I think, were really valuable characteristics, not just for us on the space station, but also for everyone down here dealing with a pandemic. And to be honest, when I came back to Earth and had to deal with all of those things now on the ground, it was much more difficult than that in space, because we're used to that in space. That's part of our environment, part of our mission, and we know that's coming. But that's not how our society is built here on the ground. So I think it's much more difficult to cope with that isolation and confinement here on the ground than it is for us as astronauts in space.
One of the things I thought when I was doing research about you was that you must have an incredible wry sense of humor, uh, and would be fun to spend time with. I love the names of some of your articles: Social Soldiers, Clean, Mean, Fighting Machine, Climate Change, A Plus for Albatross, The Cost of Whale Gulps, Size Matters, Migrating Grease, Naturally Athletic Couch Potatoes. It's funny. Have you always had that type of sense of humor? It's really
Yeah,
good.
I mean, to me, having a good sense of humor is, one of the most important aspects of life, right? You got to be able to laugh it off sometimes, and also to make fun of yourself. And, that's something I always gravitate toward, people with a good sense of humor. It's really important to me. And I think, my sense of humor can be pretty dry and sarcastic, as you say. Sometimes that gets me in trouble. Sometimes people don't understand that kind of sarcastic approach. And it's something that I do. It's one of those aspects that we were just talking about in terms of that kind of setting, that kind of isolation and confinement with the same people for 6 months. Sometimes I had to modulate that, to make sure that it wasn't taken incorrectly. But, the good thing is I was up there with a lot of people that appreciated my sense of humor. So it came in handy. And, I think making people laugh and laughing and smiling are the things that get you through a difficult day. So that's a very important thing for me.
Yes. And mentoring is also important for you. I found out that you recognize that you are, as you said, on the other side of this situation now, and that you are a role model, and you see it's important for you to share your experiences, your knowledge, and everything you've gained, and give people that guidance as they move forward.
Yes, absolutely. And I keep saying this word surreal, but that's kind of another one of those surreal moments, to think that I'm on the flip side of that mentorship now, and I'm wearing this blue suit that I dreamed about my entire life. And I do think that that is an enormous responsibility that we have as astronauts, because we do have people looking at us as role models, and we need to make sure that we represent them well and that we take that responsibility to heart. And one of the biggest things, for me, one of the biggest objectives about my mission was to make sure that I communicated and shared it with as many people back here on Earth as possible, because this was not just my mission. This wasn't a personal achievement or a personal objective. This was, not only a NASA objective or an international space partner objective. This is really for the good of humanity. It's for everybody that we do this. It's to further ourselves as a species, and I do not take that lightly. So I think it's really my responsibility to share it with you, with all of you here tonight, and to continue to share this adventure and these stories, because I know how incredibly fortunate I was to be the one that had that opportunity to be in space.
Many people would think, given your success, that there have been no failures. But I know from reading everything about you that's available that you say challenging yourself and failing is also a part of learning. Is that a hard thing to teach young people? And how do you tell them that?
Yeah, I think it is a difficult thing. I think it's a difficult thing for us all to realize as individuals, because even though it's easy for me to say right now, it's not an easy thing to do when you're faced with something that you think you might fail at. We're all scared about that. We're all scared about that at a personal level when it comes to relationships and putting yourself out there. At a professional level, when you think you're reaching for something that might be slightly outside of your reach. But, I'm sure Any other successful people can tell you these same stories. If you aren't willing to take that risk and put yourself out there, you really won't be able to reap that incredible reward. I certainly failed along the way. I could recount several failures for you. One of the biggest, I think that's appropriate for here for tonight, is the fact that this wasn't the first time I applied to be an astronaut. I started applying as soon as I had the qualifications. And in 2009, which was the class that was selected 4 years before I was selected, I applied, I got an interview, I made it all the way to the final round, which was about 40, 50 people. And everything went really well. It was so nice to be back down here in Houston. I saw some old friends and colleagues, and everything went well. And I thought, well, the chances are really low that this is going to happen, but at least it was a really positive experience. I didn't have any big regrets. And then I got that phone call, and the phone call was, Jessica, we're really glad that you came down here. Great job, but you're just not one of the people selected this time. And that was, I remember exactly where I was when I received that phone call. And it was, although I knew realistically it was such a small chance of it happening, when you're there and living it and you've gotten that far, it is still heartbreaking, of course, to think, well, that was it. That was my one chance for this lifelong dream to come true. And it didn't. Whether or not I looked at it as a personal failure or just a failure, something that happened, it didn't, it didn't work out for me. I didn't become an astronaut. And so I looked back at where I was at the time. I was just finishing my PhD in San Diego. And I thought, well, I'm so fortunate that I have this other career. I'd found this other career that made me content. And that was something that I always worried about. People when I was young would say, you're so lucky that you know exactly what you want to do. You have this goal. And in the back of my mind, I would always think, yeah, I guess I'm lucky, but what does that mean if I don't achieve it? This is something that's very difficult, if not impossible to obtain. So will I ever actually be content? So I felt so lucky that I had this other career that satisfied me. And I went on, I did my postdoctoral research, and I again found another field of research that I loved. And I loved being out in the field and working with animals. And I thought, you know what, maybe this was just right for me. Maybe being an astronaut wasn't what I was supposed to do. And it's what's going to make me happier. And this is really the place, the role that I have to play on this planet. And so I had accepted that. And when the chance came to apply again 4 years later, I actually gave it a second thought. I thought, well, I have this other career and it's probably not going to work out anyway, just like last time. I'll put all this work into it. It'll be, quite taxing both mentally and physically. And maybe I don't need to put myself through that again just to not get selected. And I have this other career that's maybe better for me anyway. But I knew in the back of my head that wasn't going to satisfy, that question, this childhood dream that I'd had my entire life. So it was a risk that I had to take. I had failed. I had to take another risk and put myself out there, knowing that there was a very good chance I was going to suffer another equivalent failure. But I did it because I had to know. And, this time the result was different. And I got the opposite phone call and was asked to come down here and join the NASA team. But if I hadn't been willing to take that risk, if I had just accepted that failure and not moved on from it, I wouldn't be here. And so I think that's just a very important thing for everybody to remember in their equivalent life trajectories. You should experience that kind of failure. That's when you learn the most. Probably when I came down here that second time to interview, I was probably a lot more relaxed. I was probably a lot more myself. I had been through it before and I thought, it's not going to work out anyway. Let's just enjoy the moment. And, maybe that's what allowed the selection committee to see me for who I was. And so I think that's just a really important lesson for people to remember.
I so agree. But isn't it a marvelous thing when you find yourself in your own dream? When I was a little boy, I used to climb a tree with a Viewmaster slide and look at Paris and Constantinople, as it was called, and Siam in those days. And in the early 90s, I happened to go to Paris to visit a friend and got off the train at the wrong stop. And I was in the exact location from which that picture that I had looked at a little boy was taken. It was such an emotional moment for me.
Wow.
When you were accepted, it must have been such an emotional moment for you to see the dream realize that you were in your dream. And
It
then
really was.
in
Yes.
the spacewalk, that
Yeah,
must
absolutely. Yeah, and
have
it was again kind of hard to realize. You know, I got that call. I was so shocked because I was thinking, oh, they're going to say no again. It's okay. And they said something else, and I was speechless. I just said something like, really? And then, you know, still, even when I came down here to work and I got my first blue flight suit and I put it on, it still was difficult to believe that that was me, that I was actually there. And I felt the same, you know, when I got to space, like I was just mentioning, looking out the window. How is this actually happening? This is the dream, that childhood dream. I love that moment that you were just describing. You know, it's so powerful to think back to those times. And it's really, you know, I think the biggest thing that I kind of fall back on is thinking when I was up there. Yes, it was a lot of hard work. There were risks that I took. I failed along the way, but I can tell you from the very first moment I got to space, it was all worth it. No doubt in my mind. And that's another thing to keep in mind as you're going through all of that journey all along. Enjoy each moment of that process because that is that special part. But in the end, it will all be worth what you put in.
I don't think there's a picture of you in space that does not have a smile. You know, you're smiling always, even when you're concentrating in some of those pictures. And I looked at a lot of them, you were always smiling. Your inner joy came through so much. It was such a satisfying experience for you, an achievement. And now you're on the Artemis team. Do you dare let yourself think about that and dream about that?
You know, I'm kind of more of a realist and I take it step by step. So until I'm actually assigned one of those missions, until I'm training for it, I don't think I would be, you know, really able to fully put myself out there quite yet. But it is interesting. That picture that I drew as a first grader, it was standing on the surface of the moon. So if I have to really go back to it, it wasn't just going to space. That astronaut in that picture of what I wanted to be was standing on the surface of the moon in a spacesuit. So I guess that is the next big one that I'll have to check off to really fulfill all these dreams. But even just to play a part of it in any role, you know, like we're doing now as astronauts, supporting all of these different activities as we get ready to take those next steps on the moon. It is just such a nice feeling to be part of that team. And another thing that's difficult to believe, maybe it's not going to be me, but I know these people. These are my friends and my colleagues that will be going back to the moon, taking those steps. And that just feels, you know, makes it so much more meaningful for us when we have that connection.
You talk frequently about STEM training and you've changed it to STEAM recently. Talk to me about that shift from science, technology, engineering, math, and then adding the arts into it. Why is that so important?
Yeah, I do think that's a critical component, and that's something that has always meant a lot to me. Of course, I mentioned earlier to becoming an astronaut, you need a STEM field degree, and that's true. You need something in a hard science or engineering or math. But for me, even though that was my chosen path, the arts were so important from the time that I was young. I started playing the piano when I was 5, and I loved music. I played the flute and the piccolo and the saxophone. I brought my piccolo up actually to the space station and played it up there because I think that those experiences in playing music, experiencing that kind of artistic expression allows your brain to open up in totally different ways. And you know, there are studies about that. We know listening to certain classical music, what that does in terms of the neural pathways that wakes up and invigorates. It's crucial to learning. It can help you learn more. It can help you be a better operator, be a better, more proficient person. And that connection is real. And it's something that I really like to try to emphasize, you know, the importance of combining the arts with the sciences. I think, first of all, it awakens these brain connections. Second of all, it makes things more accessible and understandable to more people. You know, maybe somebody that is strictly focusing on the arts doesn't quite see the connection to what I'm doing in space as an astronaut. But if I can share something else, some musical component, something that we have in common, I think we can reach more people. I heard this expressed very, very well by a pilot recently that has also the hopes of becoming an astronaut. And he was a military pilot, but also had this. His parents were professional pianists, and he grew up playing the piano and talking about these same kind of things that I was just talking about, the importance and what those sort of mental neural pathways can awaken when you're exposed to these kinds of classical music. And I think it's so powerful and important to me. It's, you know, something I try to do in my outreach as well. I have a good friend who is a rock star, and so we have some things planned that we do some outreach together. And there, I think that we can just reach more people this way, and we can make it more relatable and more accessible and have a lot more fun with it.
There are all these comments coming in talking about your being a wonderful role model, and thank you for everything you're doing and how you're inspiring young women. Um, we have even a comment from a 6-year-old who asked, what was it like in space, which you've answered. But I want to ask you sort of finally 3 simple personal questions. What were the items, personal items, that you took with you to the International Space Center?
Yeah, so there's only a small number of items that we can bring because, as you can imagine, launching things to space is very expensive. And so we only have a very small amount of personal items that we can bring. One of those things actually is just in the other room, but it's my panda, my stuffed panda that I had from the time that I was 5 years old or 6 years old. That panda has been with through me with all the different phases of my life and made it to space as well. So that was just one of these strong, material objects that's very meaningful to me, to my family, to all these people that have known me along the way. I brought up my piccolo, like I mentioned, because I wanted to make that musical connection in space, since it did play such a powerful role in my upbringing up there in band in Caribou, Maine, in the band, in the jazz band, in the marching band. That was a huge part of my life. I brought up some pictures. I brought up various things that I wanted to fly for people so that I could then give them a piece of the mission. So I had some special charms that I flew. I had, different things for different people. Sometimes flew some pictures for people or a particular item of theirs that they wanted to fly. Different astronauts have flown people's wedding rings, for example, and we can take those items. We can take a picture of that item floating in the cupola with the Earth in the background, and that's another way that we can give back to all those people that gave so much to us. So that was those are a few examples. I brought both a Swedish flag and an Israeli flag with me to represent my parents, both of my parents' home countries, which again, very, very important part about my culture and where I came from. And yeah, different things from universities that I attended so that I could, take those pictures, give back again to all those institutions that gave so much to me. So that's an example of some of the things I brought.
What does receiving an honorary degree from Bowdoin mean to you as a Mainer, as a person from Caribou?
It means a lot to me. It's absolutely an honor and really a privilege, and especially coming from my home state and from this prestigious institution like Bowdoin. Of course, I knew exactly what and where Bowdoin was growing up as a kid in Maine. And I also had a personal connection where I actually worked for a summer it used to be called Sabasco Estates. I think it's called Sabasco Lodge or something now, which you always have to drive. My parents had moved to southern Maine, and so I was there in between college years, and I would drive up to go to Sabasco for my job, lifeguarding and waitressing there. And you go right through Brunswick. So I passed through many, many times. And, Maine's a very small state with a small amount of people. Well, large state, but a small amount of people. And because of that, we have some really, really strong connections. So it means so much to me. Thank you so much to everybody at Bowdoin for this honor. And I hope I can represent you well.
I thank you very much for your time this evening, for a really insightful interview. I thank you for your humor. I thank you for your being a role model. I thank you for being that 5-year-old girl who had that dream, who made it real for yourself. You'll inspire others to make their dreams real for themselves too. Thank you very much, and good night.
Thanks so much, Alvin. This was really my pleasure.
Thank you.